So in this video we'll see this whole flow. Firstly, we will be whenever a request comes, we will create our own authentication filter which will have its own logic to filter the request and then send it to Authentication Manager. Authentication Manager will decide which authentication provider to call. In this case it will be credentials authentication provider. Then credentials authentication provider requires an authentication object, so we will tell like whenever the credentials authentication object is provided, this logic should be executed. Then we have already seen how to create user details service, user details, and fetch the data from user details, that is load user by user, load user details, and then send it to the authentication provider and everything. So now we will be just focusing on this part. So let's start by creating the authentication object. So this is our this is the code where we had stopped earlier. Let's create an authentication object. User details authentication. And I do not want it inside model, so let's refactor it. Reformat path, where is it? Let's say refactor and then move packages to directory instead of model / authentication. I just want it like this. In authentication we have user details authentication, in model we have all of this. Also I want to refactor this to another package. Instead of model.config, I just want security /config. Refactor, let's check. Okay, so in config we have password encoder config, user detail service security. Okay, let's keep these in model. We can move this somewhere else, but okay, for now it's okay. Now we have this authentication object. It will implement authentication, and let's see what all is there in authentication. So if you see, it has get authority same as that for user details object. Then get credentials, this will give us the password, what we can put password in this. Get details, this will give us the details if we want any details for that user to be provided. Get principal, we can provide username. Is authenticated, we can set it as true. And okay, these all information would be required. We will implement those methods. And in get authorities, let's keep it as null. Get credentials, for credentials we would have to use user data object so as to provide the details or the necessary data for this authentication. So let's put user data and let's put @data so that we could be able to use this user data, and all as constructor, so that whenever if we need to provide user details authentication, we could provide user data too. Get credentials, we will use user data get password. Get details, user data dot get role. Okay, we could provide role. Then user data dot get username is authenticated, let's set as true. And get name, same, user data dot get username. Okay, now our authentication object is created. So our this part is created. Now we will create an authentication provider. So let's do that. Let's create a new package in the new class. So authentication provider user details authentication provider. Let's keep it like this. Add implements authentication provider. Okay, and let's annotate it with add the root component. Let's see what is there in authentication provider. So it has authenticate and supports method. So the supports method, what it does, it checks for the authentication object. So if the authentication object, whatever value we return, for example, let's say it is a basic authentication. For that we have username, authentication token, something like that, that kind of object. If that object is there, then it will call its own authenticate of whatever authentication provider is there. That means, suppose if we are implementing our own custom authentication provider, what we will do is we will check whether it supports this authentication, the one which we just created. If it supports this authentication, then only whatever logic is present in authenticate, that will be executed. Similarly, if we have so that whenever let's say we have two authentications, but we only need to include one authentication at a time, and another authentication if the request is called with a different parameters. In that case, we will need two authentication providers, and to decide whose authenticate method should be executed, we need this supports method, which tells us that okay, you have to use this authentication provider instead of the other one. This is the whole logic. Let's do that. If this supports method does not match, for example, if the authentication which is incoming, it does not match with this supports method, this authentication would not be executed. This authenticate method would not be executed. Let's implement it. Authenticate. Firstly, let's validate whether this authentication dot equals our authentication details, user details authentication. This is the class that we created. So if this matches, that is whatever incoming request, its authentication is user details authentication, then only execute this logic. So in this logic, we'll just check whether the password which is coming, it matches with the password that we have stored in the database. For that, we will have to fetch the user from database to get the password. So let's do that. So user details this one details is equal to load user by user. If you remember, we have this load user by username, this method in our user details service security. So let's auto wire it and then use it. Public user now we will call that method. So user detail service security dot load user by username authentication dot get principal, or we can use get name because it has it will be having the same, that is username only, but get name seems more natural. Okay, now we have this user details object. We will check whether the password provided in authentication, it matches with the password we have in our DP. So if authentication dot get credentials, if you remember, in get credentials we have stored password dot equals user details dot get password. If this matches, then only the authentication is successful. So that means we can just return authentication without throwing any exception. If this is not the case, then we will just throw an exception. Let's say a runtime exception. saying that username or password invalid. Let's keep invalid username or password. This looks more meaningful. Okay, now so we have created our authentication object and our authentication provider. Now we have to tell authentication manager that this is a custom authentication provider that we have created, and also include this whenever you are authenticating. So let's add that. For that we would have to configure. So this was our password encoder config which we had created before. In this we have just this bean. Instead of naming it as password encoder config, let's rename it to project config so that we could put all the project's configurations over here. Or project security config. This looks more meaningful. And let's create bean for our authentication manager. Authentication manager, and it accepts one HTTP security parameter, and inside this we have to create authentication manager builder. Not new, we have to take it from HTTP security dot, I think it is get shared objects, yeah, this one. And then we have to provide the class of our authentication manager. So authentication manager builder dot class, this one. And once this is there, then we have to tell authentication manager builder dot authentication provider that okay, we have created this authentication provider, so include it. So let's auto wire it over here first. Project security config. Okay, let's include it. And then initialize it. And authentication provider, in this we will provide this authentication provider. That's all. And then just return this authentication builder dot build, because we have to return authentication manager. Okay, add exception to method signature. Okay, this is done. So okay, so for now we have created authentication manager. Now we have to create authentication filter and add it in our security filters list. Okay, so let's do that. For that, let's create a filter first. Filter dot user authentication filter. This is created. Now it should extend once per request filter. So once per request filter, this is the one which has a do filter method, this one. So this do filter method, we need to implement it so as to use our logic, that is our filter logic. For that, okay, so let's annotate it with @component. And since this is done, let's implement the methods do filter. Okay, now the idea is whenever we are sending a request, we will be sending username and password as the headers, and then we will be validating those headers. Okay, so for that, let's assume that we are getting username in the request dot header. work request.get header, and let's say they are passing username, string, password, okay. Now we have this username and password. Now we have to create this authentication object so that whenever this filter sends it to Authentication Manager, it it knows that it does has an authentication provider, so it will go and check whether the authentication object it matches with user details authentication or not. If this matches, then only it will be executed. So for that we have to explicitly provide this we have to explicitly create the authentication of this of user details authentication. Okay, so let's do that. User details no, not this one. User details authentication, yeah, this one. User details authentication is equal to user details authentication sorry. For that we have to create an authentication object over here. Authentication manager. Okay, we don't have authentication manager over here. Manager. Okay, now we have to say authentication manager dot authenticate of new user details authentication. This is the object which will help us in calling the authentication provider, and let's provide a new user data of username, password, and for role let's put it as null for now. Okay, this does not work because we have not explicitly added all args constructor, and let's add no args constructor too. Instead of this we could always use a builder, yeah, but for now let's go with this approach. Now since we have created it in authentication filter, this will not give any exception. Now we have to set this in our security context holder. Security context holder context dot set authentication will be now this authentication. So now this will tell that okay, whatever authentication is coming, it is of user details authentication. This is the meaning of this. Now we just have to add it. Filter chain dot do filter, then request and response. This is what it requires. Okay, now since we have included our own filter, we have to tell the Spring Security what is the order for this. For that, let's go to project security config, and inside this we have to create bean. What's this? @bean, and then a public security filter chain. Where is it? Filter chain of this will accept HTTP security, and inside we have to tell where this authentication filter should be, at what stage this should be executed. So http security dot add filter at, we will add it at the basic authentication filter. So whenever that is, whatever is the order of basic authentication filter, it will be this authentication filter, our user authentication filter will be of the same order. So new what is that, user authentication filter, and then we also provide this authentication manager inside it. And for http security, we have it from http security, and where we are adding, it's at basic authentication filter class. We have to add this, and now return http security dot print. This is the one. Okay, now we have, let's go to the diagram again. We have user data table, we have user details, we have user detail service, we have created creds authentication, which is our username authentication, and then we have credentials authentication provider, which is our users details authentication provider. We have configured a bean for authentication manager and added this authentication provider in this authentication manager. And then we have created a security filter, authentication filter, and we have also included this. We have provided the order for this, that it should be at the same order of basic authentication filter. And now whenever the request comes, it will first come to our filter chain, because this is at basic security filter. So it will go over here, it will check for request. In request, it will see username and password, and it will convert it to user details authentication object. Now from this, it will come to our authentication manager which is in our config. So it will come over here. We have provided this authentication provider too, that is our user details authentication provider. So authentication manager has its own authentication providers. It will check whether the authentication object which is coming, it matches with any of the authentication providers it has. So in our case, it will match with user details authentication provider. When it matches, it will when the supports returns true, this authenticate logic will be executed. In this, we are just loading the user from the database, and then we are checking whether the password it matches with the one which we have received in this authentication. If it matches, then just return it, that is this request is valid, is coming from a valid user. If it is not, then we are just going to throw an exception. That's all we have configured until now. Let's run this, let's check. Okay, our application has started. Now let's hit the demo/hello endpoint with headers, that is username and password. Let's provide valid username and password. So it does return us with hello. If you see the logs, it says nothing. To validate whether our authenticate is only calling, so we'll just add a logger over here. Authenticating user details. Okay, let's rerun. Okay, so our application started again. Now let's try to send it. It returns hello, and if you see over here, you see authenticating user details. It means that our authenticate method is the one which is getting called. Now let's try with invalid username and password. Let's send it. It says internal server error. If we go inside this, we'll see one runtime exception, user not found. Okay, that's all. Thanks.